A famous actor named Keanu Reeves was wrongfully detained by two police officers, Riley and Jenkins. When his true identity was revealed, the entire police station was left in stunned silence. What exactly happened, and who really is Keanu Reeves to provoke such a monumental reaction? Let's find out. But before we get into the story, let us know where you're watching from today, and if you enjoy the story, don't forget to subscribe. It was an ordinary morning in the bustling city. Sunlight streamed between skyscrapers, casting long shadows over the streets. People were starting their daily routines, heading to work, grabbing coffee, walking dogs, while the city buzzed with life. Among the crowd was Keanu Reeves, strolling calmly through the neighborhood. He was a contrast to the hurried commuters around him. Mid-50s, clad in a smart, understated suit, Keanu walked with quiet poise. His simple, grounded demeanor always attracted attention, not because he sought it, but because it seemed effortlessly natural. That morning, he'd finished a modest breakfast at a small diner he often visited. Scrambled eggs, turkey bacon, and fruit, served by a staff who knew him by name. As he approached his car, a black sedan parked just off the main street, he checked his phone and found a text from his mom. Smiling softly, he replied, looking forward to their dinner later. Family meant everything to him. Just as Keanu was about to unlock his car, two officers approached. Riley and Jenkins were new faces, unfamiliar in a neighborhood that often saw fresh rotations on the force. Their stern expressions and unrelenting gazes immediately set Keanu on edge. Although he'd spent years in the public eye, moments like this were different. Keanu's father had always advised him to stay calm, respectful, and non-confrontational when dealing with police. Lessons he carried with him still. "Excuse me, sir," Riley called out. Keanu turned, hands by his sides, his phone still in one hand. "Yes, officer," he replied evenly, spotting the name on Riley's badge. Jenkins hovered behind, his hand resting on his belt near his holster. "May I see some ID?" Riley's tone was clipped, more a command than a request. Keanu remained composed. "Could you explain why, officer?" "Just show us your ID, sir," Riley pressed, a hint of a smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. Keanu nodded, reached slowly into his jacket, and handed over his ID without a word. Riley scrutinized it while Jenkins shifted his stance, a tension hanging in the air. "What are you doing here?" Riley asked, his tone sharp. "I'm headed to my car," Keanu answered. "Is something wrong?" Riley ignored the question, his smirk returning. "We've had reports of suspicious activity. You match the description." Keanu's stomach sank. He'd been through his share of uncomfortable interaction, but this was different. "I see," he said carefully. "I just had breakfast down the street and I'm heading to work. I don't think I'm who you're looking for." "What kind of work do you do to Riley's tone was laced with disbelief. "I'm an actor," Keanu replied calmly. Riley paused, his smirk faltering for the first time. Jenkins, now emboldened, chimed in. "You sure there's nothing in that car we should know about?" "No, officer, I'm not hiding anything," Keanu said, his voice steady. "You're welcome to look, but I'd prefer to get to work on time." "You don't get to decide what we do," Riley snapped. "Step away from the car." Keanu hesitated. He hadn't done anything wrong, but he also knew how quickly situations like these could spiral. Slowly, he raised his hand slightly, stepping back from the vehicle. Before he could react further, Riley abruptly grabbed his arm and twisted it behind his back. The sudden move caused Keanu to gasp in pain. Jenkins was on him in an instant, forcing him to the ground. The star struggled to keep his composure. "What are you doing?" he asked firmly. "You're under arrest for resisting arrest," Riley declared coldly, slapping cuffs around Keanu's wrists. Keanu's mind raced. He hadn't resisted. He'd complied every step of the way, but now he was face down on the pavement, handcuffed and humiliated, while the officers stood over him as if he were a criminal. They had made up their minds the moment they saw him. By now, the commotion had drawn the attention of people nearby. An elderly woman, Mrs. Agnes Carter, who lived in the apartment building across the street, watched in horror from her balcony. She knew Keanu. She had seen him in the neighborhood many times and knew he wasn't a troublemaker. "What are you doing to him?" she called out, her voice trembling with outrage. He didn't do anything wrong. A young couple walking their dog had also stopped to watch. The man pulled out his phone and started recording. "This is messed up," he muttered to his girlfriend. "They're arresting him for nothing." Keanu caught sight of the phone recording and, for a brief moment, felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe the footage would help him later. Maybe it would show people the truth of what happened. But for now, he was powerless. As the officers pulled him to his feet, he forced himself to stay calm, to focus. He knew he had to be careful with what he said next. Anything could be used against him. As they led him toward the police car, the crowd began to grow, more people stopping to watch, to record. to shout their disapproval at the officers. "This isn't right," one man shouted from across the street. "He didn't do anything." But Riley and Jenkins ignored them, their faces set with cold determination. They pushed Keanu into the back of the squad car, slamming the door shut behind him. Before they could drive away, Keanu turned his head to look out the window at the crowd. He could see the concern, the anger, the confusion on their faces. He took a deep breath, knowing he had to say something, even if it was just a few words. "This isn't over," he said luckily, his voice carrying through the thin glass. "This isn't over." The words hung in the air as the car pulled away, leaving the stunned crowd behind. Inside the car, Keanu's mind raced with thoughts of what would happen next, how he would fight this, how he would make sure justice was served. The police station was a stark contrast to the bustling streets outside. Cold gray walls, harsh fluorescent lights, and the constant hum of activity set the scene. Officers moved briskly through the corridors, some chatting, others focused on their tasks. The station was busy, but there was an underlying tension in the air, the kind that made people speak in hushed tones and glance over their shoulders. Keanu Reeves was led through the station's front doors, his hands still cuffed behind his back. Officer Riley and Officer Jenkins flanked him, their expressions unreadable. As they passed through the booking area, a few officers glanced up, their eyes narrowing slightly as they took in Keanu's appearance. He was clearly not the usual suspect they brought in, a well-dressed man with an air of calmness that seemed out of place. "Over here," Riley barked, steering Keanu toward a desk where a tired-looking officer sat behind a computer. The officer glanced up, then down at the screen, barely acknowledging Keanu's presence. "Name?" the officer asked, his fingers poised over the keyboard. "Keanu Reeves," Riley replied before Keanu could speak. The officer typed the name into the system, his eyes scanning the screen. He frowned slightly but didn't say anything. Instead, he motioned for Riley to bring Keanu over to the fingerprinting station. "Let's get this over with," Riley muttered, pushing Keanu forward. Keanu didn't resist. He knew better than to give them any reason to make things worse. As they took his fingerprints, he remained silent, his mind racing. He couldn't believe this was happening. He had done nothing wrong, yet here he was, being treated like a criminal. But he knew he had to stay calm, had to think clearly. This wasn't the first time he had faced this kind of situation, and it likely wouldn't be the last. Once the fingerprinting was done, Riley and Jenkins led Keanu to a small holding cell at the back of the station. The cell was cramped, with a narrow bench along one wall and a metal toilet in the corner. The air was thick with the smell of disinfectant and something else, something sour and unpleasant. They uncuffed him and shoved him inside. "Make yourself comfortable," Jenkins sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You might be here for a while." Keanu sat down on the bench, taking a deep breath. He didn't respond to the taunts. There was no point. He knew they were trying to provoke him, trying to get a reaction, but he wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. As Riley and Jenkins walked away, they exchanged a glance, a silent understanding passing between them. They had done their job, brought in another troublemaker, and now they could move on to whatever came next. But there was something about this arrest that gnawed at Riley, something that made him uneasy. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but the way Keanu had handled himself, the calmness, the confidence, it didn't fit the profile of someone they usually picked up. "Think he's an actor, huh?" Jenkins scoffed as they walked back to the front desk. "Probably just another punk with a fancy suit." "Yeah," Riley muttered, though his mind was elsewhere. He wasn't so sure anymore. Something about Keanu was off, but he couldn't figure out what it was. He shook his head, trying to push the thought away. It didn't matter. They had their orders, and they had followed them. That was all there was to it. But as they reached the desk, a young officer who had been quietly observing the scene stepped forward. His name was Officer Stevens, and he had been with the department for only a few months. He was eager to prove himself, to show that he could handle the job. But he was also smart, smarter than most gave him credit for. "Hey, Riley," Stevens called out, his voice low. "Can I talk to you for a second?" Riley glanced at him, frowning. "What is it?" Stevens hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "That guy you just brought in, Keanu Reeves, I think I know who he is." Riley's frown deepened. "What are you talking about?" Stevens leaned in closer, lowering his voice even more. "I saw him in a news article a few weeks ago. He's not just some guy. He's a famous actor, Keanu Reeves. He's been in some of the biggest movies ever. You might want to be careful with this one. If it's him, this could blow up in our faces." Riley didn't respond immediately. He felt a knot form in his stomach, but pushed it down. This couldn't be true. They had arrested him fair and square. There was no way he could be someone important. But the doubt was there now, nagging at his stomach. "I'll handle it," Riley said curtly, dismissing Stevens with a wave of his hand, But as he turned away, he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in his chest. Stevens watched Riley walk off, then pulled out his phone. He quickly scrolled through his contacts, finding the number he needed. With a deep breath, he dialed, praying he was making the right decision. The phone rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "Yeah? Captain, it's Stevens," he said, keeping his voice low. "We have a situation here at the station. I think you need to know about it." Meanwhile, back in the holding cell, Keanu sat quietly, his thoughts focused. Keanu Reeves knew this wasn't just about him. This was about something bigger. He felt certain that he'd been targeted, though he didn't know why. As he waited, he kept his composure, refusing to let fear take hold. He had faced worse before and knew he would endure this as well. An hour passed before the door to the holding area swung open, and a woman entered. She was in her late 30s, with sharp, discerning eyes and an air of authority that made everyone stop and take notice. Lieutenant Kate Thompson had recently transferred to the station, arriving from another precinct just a few weeks earlier. Though still familiarizing herself with the team, she had already established that she was not to be underestimated. Her gaze swept the room, taking in the officers at work. Spotting Riley and Jenkins at the front desk, their hushed conversation and uneasy postures drew her attention. Something was off, and her instincts told her so. She had learned to trust those instincts. "Riley, Jenkins," she called out, striding toward them. "What's going on here?" Riley glanced up, startled. "Nothing much, ma'am. Just another day." Thompson's eyes narrowed. "Really? Because I heard you brought someone in this morning, a man named Keanu Reeves." Riley stiffened, recovering quickly. "Yes, ma'am, we did." "And what was the charge?" she asked, her tone calm but probing. "Resisting arrest," Riley answered steadily. "We had reason to believe he was involved in suspicious activity. When we questioned him, he refused to cooperate." Thompson raised a skeptical eyebrow. "Is that so?" "Yes, ma'am," Riley nodded. Thompson studied Riley's face. She had dealt with officers like him before, those who bent the rules to suit their needs. But she was different. She had climbed the ranks by following the book and expected the same from her team. "Take me to him," she ordered, leaving no room for argument. Riley hesitated briefly before nodding. "Right this way, ma'am." As they walked toward the holding cells, Thompson couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this situation than Riley let on. Upon reaching Keanu's cell, she stopped and locked eyes with the man inside. Seated on the bench, his hands rested in his lap, and his posture was relaxed despite the circumstances. His calmness gave her pause. "This is him?" she asked Riley. "Yes, ma'am," he confirmed. "Like I said, he resisted arrest, so we had no choice but to bring him in." Thompson didn't respond immediately. She stepped into the cell, her gaze meeting Keanu's steady eyes. He didn't seem intimidated nor defiant, just composed. "Mr. Reeves," Thompson said, her voice measured. "I'm Lieutenant Kate Thompson. I'm here to ask you a few questions." "Of course, Lieutenant," Keanu replied politely. "I'm happy to cooperate." Thompson nodded, appreciating his calm demeanor. "I've been told that you resisted arrest, which led to your being brought in. I'd like to hear your side of the story." Keanu held her gaze and replied evenly. "Lieutenant, I did no such thing. I complied with every instruction from Officers Riley and Jenkins. I was walking to my car when they stopped me. When I asked them why I was being detained, that simple question seemed to escalate the situation. Before I knew it, I was handcuffed and accused of resisting arrest, despite following their orders." Thompson listened closely, her eyes narrowing slightly. His calm, measured tone, coupled with an underlying firmness, suggested he wasn't merely trying to talk his way out of trouble. She turned to Riley, who stood a few feet away, his expression carefully neutral. "Is that true, Riley?" "Riley," Thompson asked sharply. "Did Mr. Reeves comply with your instructions?" Riley shifted uncomfortably. "Well, ma'am, he questioned us. Things got tense. We had reason to believe he might be hiding something." Thompson's gaze hardened. "And what exactly was that reason?" Riley hesitated, unable to provide a convincing response. "It was just a gut feeling, ma'am." "A gut feeling?" Thompson repeated incredulously. "Is that the basis for your arrest now?" Riley opened his mouth to respond, but was interrupted by the sound of the holding area door opening. Everyone turned to see Officer Stevens entering, slightly out of breath. He hesitated, noting the tense scene, then addressed Thompson directly. "Lieutenant, I need to speak with you," Stevens said urgently, glancing between Keanu and Riley. Thompson gave Riley a final hard look and before stepping out of the cell. "What is it, Stevens?" Lowering his voice, Stevens replied, "Ma'am, I've been digging into Mr. Reeves's background. He's not just any man. He's a world-famous actor. A household name. If it comes out that we arrested him without cause, it's going to blow up in our faces." Thompson's stomach dropped. She had suspected something more to the story, but hearing the full weight of who Keanu was made the situation even more serious. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice steady despite her growing concern. "Positive," Stevens replied. handing her his phone with a web page pulled up. It displayed Keanu's profile, highlighting his iconic roles in philanthropic efforts. This is him. If we don't handle this carefully, we're looking at a PR nightmare. Quickly scanning the page, Thompson's eyes widened as she absorbed the details of Keanu's career and public image. He wasn't just a celebrity, he was someone whose arrest would become front-page news. She turned her gaze back to Riley, who stood beside Jenkins, both officers looking increasingly uneasy. "Riley Jenkins," Thompson called out, her tone urgent. "We need to talk. Now." The two exchanged uneasy glances before following Thompson out of the holding area. Once they reached a more private part of the station, Thompson rounded on them, her expression fierce. "Do you have any idea who you've just arrested?" she demanded, her voice low but intense. "Keanu Reeves isn't just some guy off the street. He's one of the most well-known actors in the world. If he decides to sue us, we're in serious trouble." Riley paled, his usual bravado faltering. "Ma'am, we didn't know. He didn't say anything about being an actor." "It doesn't matter," Thompson snapped. "You should have done your due diligence before bringing him in." Now, Keanu Reeves understood that this wasn't just about him. This was part of something much bigger. He knew he'd been targeted, though the reasons remained unclear. As the minutes dragged on, he forced himself to remain composed, holding fear at bay. He had endured worse in the past and believed he could weather this storm as well. Then the door to the holding area swung open and a woman entered. In her late 30s, with sharp, watchful eyes and an air of authority, Lieutenant Kate Thompson commanded attention as soon as she walked into the room. New to the station, she had arrived only weeks before, but she had already proven herself to be someone who followed the rules, expected the same from her team, and would not back down from a challenge. The tension outside the station was escalating. The sounds of raised voices filtered in, their intensity increasing with every passing minute. Kate's head snapped up. Protesters were gathering, and the chants demanding Keanu's release were growing louder. "Great," she muttered. "Just what we needed." A young officer, Stevens, stepped forward, looking pale. "Lieutenant, the crowd is getting bigger. Activists, community leaders, and even some media. If we don't act quickly, this could spiral out of control." Kate nodded. Stevens wasn't exaggerating. She had seen situations like this evolve into full-blown crises before. But this wasn't just about managing a tense crowd or diffusing a volatile incident. This was about the integrity of the department, her reputation, and the legal and public relations nightmare they now faced. She had no time to waste. "Riley Jenkins," she barked, her voice sharp and commanding. "Prepare a full report on the arrest. Every step you took and why. I don't care how long it takes, just get it done. Stevens, start preparing a statement for the press. We need to control the narrative before it gets out of hand." The officers scattered to carry out her orders. Kate felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her shoulders. This was far from the routine day she had expected when she arrived at the station that morning. Yet she refused to let this define her career or tarnish the department's reputation. She had to take charge. Inside his cell, Keanu sat quietly, listening to the commotion outside. The chants of the crowd grew louder, echoing through the station's halls. He knew his family was likely among them, along with the community leaders and activists who had supported him in the past. While a faint flicker of hope rose within him, Keanu was not yet ready to feel relieved. He knew how these situations could be twisted, manipulated by those in power. He wouldn't underestimate them. Back at the front of the station, the crowd had swelled to more than 100 people. Signs and banners demanding justice were visible everywhere, and television cameras were trained on the scene, broadcasting the growing unrest. The station had become a flashpoint for the community's frustrations. Kate watched it all unfold from the front window, her jaw tight with frustration. She knew she needed to act, and fast. The wrong move could cause the situation to explode, but doing nothing would ensure it spiraled further out of control. "We need to release him," she said finally, her tone firm. "It's the only way to de-escalate this." Stevens nodded. "But what do we tell the media? They're not going to accept that we just let him go without a reason." Kate considered this for a moment. "We frame it as a misunderstanding. We say that after reviewing the evidence, we determined there was no basis for the arrest and that we decided to release him. We emphasize that we take these matters seriously and that we're committed to justice and fairness." It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was the best they had. With luck, it would be enough to calm the crowd and prevent further escalation. The bigger picture was what mattered now: the department's integrity, the town's stability, and the public's trust. Turning away from the window, Kate made her way to the holding area. She passed Riley and Jenkins on the way, who were both furiously typing their reports. She paused for a brief moment, leveling a steely gaze at them. "When this is over, we're going to have a long conversation about what went wrong here," she said coldly. "And trust me, it won't be pretty." Riley swallowed hard and nodded silently, knowing he was in deep trouble. But for now, there was little he could do except hope that Kate's actions would somehow fix the mess they had created. When Kate reached Keanu's cell, she unlocked the door herself and stepped inside, her expression measured. "Mr. Reeves," she said firmly, "I've reviewed the situation, and it's clear that there was a misunderstanding. You're free to go." Keanu rose slowly, his expression guarded. "A misunderstanding, Lieutenant? Is that what we're calling it?" Kate met his gaze without flinching. "Yes, I'm deeply sorry for what happened today. It should never have gone this far." Keanu studied her for a long moment, as if searching for any trace of insincerity. Finally, he nodded. "I appreciate your apology, Lieutenant, but you should know that this isn't over." Kate nodded in turn, fully aware of what was coming. "I understand." Her priority now was to escort Keanu out safely and diffuse the tension outside. As they walked past the other officers, many avoided his gaze, their faces betraying their discomfort. When they reached the station's front door, Kate paused. "I'll do everything I can to make this right," she said quietly. Keanu nodded, then stepped outside. The crowd erupted into cheers at the sight of him. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, but Keanu remained calm, walking toward his waiting family and friends. As he embraced his loved ones, Kate stood in the doorway, watching silently. She knew this was only the beginning. Keanu Reeves wouldn't let the matter rest, and the repercussions of this day would be felt for a long time. For now, however, the immediate crisis had been averted. The crowd began to disperse, reporters packed up their equipment, and the tension that had gripped the station started to ease. Yet Kate knew her work wasn't done. She still had to address the damage that had been done, and she intended to face it head-on. As Keanu walked away from the station, he understood this was just the start of a new battle. Though he had been wronged, he also knew how to transform that injustice into a powerful force for change. The truth would come out, and when it did, the station, the department, and the entire town would never be the same again. They hadn't just arrested a man, they'd arrested a catalyst for something much larger. The way Keanu Reeves had carried himself, calm, composed, almost as though he expected all of it, stuck in Lieutenant Kate Thompson's mind. She'd learned long ago to trust her instincts, and right now her instincts told her this story was far from over. Beyond her office door, the station buzzed with a muted energy. The earlier crowd outside had mostly dispersed, but the atmosphere among the officers was tense. Few met each other's eyes, and the weight of what had happened hung over everyone. The reputation of the department had taken a hit, and no one expected this to simply blow over. In the stillness of her office, Thompson leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. The silence contrasted sharply with the turmoil in her mind. She knew she needed answers about who Keanu Reeves truly was and why his arrest had triggered such a strong public reaction. She couldn't let this go unexamined. Thompson turned to her computer, her fingers moving swiftly across the keyboard as she started her search. The results were eye-opening. News articles, interviews, and online profiles painted a vivid picture. Keanu Reeves was no ordinary man. He wasn't just a famous actor. He was a global icon known for his philanthropy, advocacy, and connections to some of the most high-profile humanitarian cases in the world. His reputation extended far beyond Hollywood. As she dug deeper, Thompson uncovered something chilling. Keanu had recently been involved in high-profile advocacy for victims of police misconduct. While he wasn't a lawyer, his influence had helped draw attention to federal investigations and legal cases that had reshaped how law enforcement departments were scrutinized. His support for these cases had led to policy changes and, in some instances, federal oversight of entire precincts. If word got out that the station had wrongfully detained him, it wouldn't just be a local scandal. It could ignite a firestorm of national outrage. Her heart sank as she pieced it all together. This wasn't just about an arrest made on a shaky pretext. Keanu Reeves had been quietly supporting investigations into systemic abuse of power within law enforcement. And now, the officers who had detained him, unaware of his influence, had inadvertently dragged their department into the spotlight. Thompson reached for her phone and called a trusted contact within the FBI. The conversation was brief, but confirmed her fears. Keanu Reeves wasn't merely a public figure. He was someone whose advocacy had helped prompt federal scrutiny of police practices nationwide. If the public learned how he'd been treated, it could bring down more than just the station's reputation. It could have nationwide consequences. Thompson knew she needed to confront Riley and Jenkins. But first, she spent another hour compiling everything she could about Keanu's advocacy, his public work, and the ongoing federal investigations. The more she found, the more urgent the situation became. When she finally stood up, she felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She headed toward the officer's bullpen, each step bringing her closer to the confrontation. When she reached Riley and Jenkins, she found them at their desks, reviewing their reports. Both looked up as she approached, their postures stiffening. "Lieutenant," Riley greeted her cautiously, "is there something you need?" Thompson folded her arms and fixed them with a hard stare. "We need to talk, now." The two officers exchanged a glance, then followed her into a nearby conference room. The room was stark, just a table, a few chairs, and the tense atmosphere they brought with them. Thompson closed the door behind her and turned to face them, her expression steely. "What's this about?" Jenkins asked, his attempt at casualness betrayed by the edge in his voice. "I know who Keanu Reeves is," Thompson said bluntly. Riley's eyes widened slightly while Jenkins paled. Neither said a word, but the flicker of panic in their expressions told her everything she needed to know. They hadn't realized who they'd arrested, and now it was catching up with them. "Do you have any idea what kind of trouble you've caused?" Thompson demanded, her tone low and firm. "Keanu Reeves is an internationally recognized figure, known for shining a light on corruption and abuse of power. By detaining him without cause, you've put the entire department at risk." Riley's face drained of color. "Lieutenant, we didn't know. He didn't say anything about his involvement in—" "It doesn't matter what he said," Thompson interrupted, her voice rising. "You should have done your due diligence before making that arrest. Instead, you jumped to conclusions, and now we're all in the middle of a mess that could destroy our careers." Jenkins looked down at his feet, his face pale. "What do we do now, Lieutenant?" Before Thompson could answer, the door burst open. Chief of Police Frank Daniels strode in, his face a storm of anger. "Lieutenant Thompson," he barked, his voice booming, "what the hell is going on here?" Thompson turned to face the chief, her posture straight and steady. "Chief, we have a serious problem. Keanu Reeves?" "I know exactly who Keanu Reeves is," Daniel snapped, cutting her off. His voice was tight with frustration, his words dripping with venom. "And I know exactly what kind of mess you've made." Thompson blinked, taken aback. "Chief, I'd save it," Daniel said, his tone sharp. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You detained a man who's a household name, someone known for exposing corruption. You've just handed him all the ammunition he needs to take us down. This is a disaster, and it's on you." Thompson's jaw tightened. "With all due respect, Chief, this isn't just on me. Officers Riley and Jenkins made the arrest without proper cause." Daniels' eyes flicked to the two officers, his expression hardening. "Oh, don't worry," he said coldly. "We're going to have a long talk about what went wrong, and you'd better believe it won't be pretty. We don't act now, the entire department might crumble." Daniel straightened his uniform, smoothing out wrinkles, as if by tidying his appearance, he could also fix the chaos swirling around him. He nodded toward the door. "Let's do it." When they stepped outside, the crowd erupted into a chorus of demands and accusations. The sea of faces, furrowed brows, clenched fists, and eyes burning with frustration spoke volumes. It wasn't just Keanu Reeves' wrongful arrest fueling the outrage. It was years of perceived injustices, now brought to a boiling point. Reporters jostled for position, cameras clicking as they aimed their lenses at the beleaguered chief and his lieutenant. Daniels took a deep breath, walked up to the makeshift podium, and adjusted the microphone. For a moment, the crowd quieted, waiting to see if he'd offer excuses or genuine remorse. "Good afternoon," Daniels began, his voice carrying over the murmurs. "I'm here today to address the events that took place this morning and to offer a direct apology to Mr. Keanu Reeves." The mention of Keanu's name caused a ripple through the crowd. Cameras zoomed in and a few voices called out questions, but Daniels raised his hand, signaling for silence. "This department made a grave mistake," he continued. "We detained a man without proper cause. This should never have happened. On behalf of the entire police department, I want to express my deepest apologies to Mr. Reeves and to our community. What occurred does not reflect our commitment to justice, fairness, and integrity." Daniels paused, glancing over his shoulder at Thompson. She gave a slight nod, urging him to press on. "I also want to acknowledge," Daniel said, his voice firm, "that this incident is a symptom of larger issues within our department. Lieutenant Thompson has been working tirelessly to investigate these issues, and I'm here to tell you that we will confront them head-on. We will cooperate fully with federal oversight, and we will take every step necessary to rebuild trust with this community." There was a murmur among the crowd, less anger now, more a mix of cautious optimism and skepticism. Daniels took a step back from the podium, allowing Thompson to approach. "Mr. Reeves," she said, addressing him directly, "I want to thank you for your patience and your courage. The investigation you're a part of is crucial. We recognize the injustice you faced, and we are committed to ensuring that no one else experiences the same treatment. Keanu stepped forward, his calm demeanor commanding attention. His presence alone seemed to lend the moment a gravity that words couldn't match. "Thank you, Lieutenant," Keanu said, his voice steady. "This is not just about one person. This is about changing the culture and ensuring accountability. I'll hold you to your word." The crowd cheered, the sound swelling until it filled the air like a cathartic release. Reporters shouted questions, but Keanu only smiled slightly and walked back toward his family, leaving the podium to the department officials. Back inside the station, the atmosphere shifted slightly. Officers whispered among themselves, the weight of what had just happened settling in. Thompson looked at Daniels as they walked back through the station's halls. "That was the first step," she said, "but we have a long road ahead." Daniels nodded. "It's going to take more than words. We need action, transparency, and a willingness to admit when we've been wrong." Thompson knew that the true challenge was only just beginning, but for the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of hope, an acknowledgement that change, while difficult, might finally be possible. Everyone in the room understood that words and promises wouldn't be enough this time. Action was what counted. The room buzzed with the energy of determination and hope. Keanu Reeves sat at the head of the table, listening intently as different voices around him shared their thoughts. Community leaders brought up the need for transparent policies, activists demanded accountability, and legal experts discussed strategies for implementing oversight and ensuring fairness. A middle-aged woman with a warm but resolute tone leaned forward. "What we need, first and foremost, is an independent review board, one that has real authority to investigate incidents of misconduct and hold people accountable." Several heads around the table nodded in agreement. Keanu, his usual calm demeanor now coupled with a quiet intensity, finally spoke. "You're right. This can't just be about making statements. We need a structure in place, something permanent that ensures everyone is treated fairly, no matter who they are." A young activist chimed in, her voice passionate. "And we need to involve the youth. If we want to create lasting change, we have to empower the next generation. They're the ones who'll carry this forward." Keanu's lips curved into a small, thoughtful smile. "Absolutely. If we're not including them, we're not building a future. This isn't just about fixing what's wrong now. It's about creating something better for tomorrow." The conversation went on for hours, ideas building on one another as the group worked to shape a plan that could truly address the systemic problems they were up against. Despite the weight of the task ahead, there was a sense of unity in the room. For the first time, it felt as though they were moving from outrage to action, from frustration to a clear path forward. As the night stretched on, Keanu glanced around the table, taking in the determined faces of those who had stepped up to make a difference. "We've got a long road ahead," he said, his voice steady. "But together, we can do this. This isn't about any one person. It's about all of us, working together to make real, meaningful change." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. Then one by one, everyone at the table nodded. They weren't just a group of individuals anymore. They were a movement ready to push forward and demand justice, equality, and accountability. The fight was far from over, but in that small community center, late into the night, the seeds of real, lasting change were being planted. Keanu Reeves stood at the center of it all, taking in the diverse perspectives offered by the passionate community members around him. Maria Hernandez, a local teacher, passionately argued that meaningful change had to start with educating the youth, while Dr. James Carter, a sociology professor, insisted on addressing the immediate needs of those most affected by systemic injustices. As each person shared their vision for a more just community, Keanu nodded, taking detailed notes and asking thoughtful questions. He was inspired by the commitment and expertise that filled the room. This wasn't just a meeting, it was the beginning of a collaborative movement that drew strength from every corner of the community. After hours of discussion, the group began solidifying their plans. They agreed to establish a free legal aid clinic to help those who couldn't afford representation. They formed a community oversight board to work alongside the police department's internal affairs division. And they devised educational initiatives for schools and local community centers, focused on civil rights, civic engagement, and conflict resolution. By the time they adjourned, everyone felt energized and focused, ready to take the first steps toward a brighter future. In the following months, these efforts began to bear fruit. The police department, guided by Lieutenant Thompson and the new oversight board, introduced de-escalation training and cultural sensitivity programs. Officers like Stevens, who had shown a genuine desire to improve, partnered with community leaders and social workers to build trust and understanding. The legal aid clinic handled dozens of cases, providing much-needed representation to individuals wrongfully arrested or mistreated. In schools across the city, students participated in new educational programs that empowered them with knowledge of their rights and encouraged them to become active, engaged citizens. The city's atmosphere started to shift. Neighborhood watch groups worked alongside police officers to improve safety without relying on profile announcing. Regular community forums created open dialogue between citizens and local officials. Although challenges and resistance still surfaced, the difference was that now the city had mechanisms in place to address them, to hold people accountable, and to keep moving forward. 6 months after the pivotal event that had sparked this movement, Keanu returned to the police station, not as a victim, but as a partner. Invited to speak at a training session for new recruits, he was there to share his perspective and help shape the future of law enforcement. Walking through the station's halls, he noticed a shift in the atmosphere. Officers nodded in recognition, some even stopping to shake his hand. The tension that once filled the building was gradually being replaced with a sense of respect and openness. Lieutenant Thompson greeted him at the training room door. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Reeves," she said, her tone warm and sincere. "I think your perspective will be invaluable for these recruits." Keanu smiled. "I'm glad to be here. And please, call me Keanu." Inside the room, rows of young faces turned to look at him. Some were curious, others guarded, but he all seemed willing to listen. He understood their hesitation. He represented a challenge to the status quo, but he also saw the potential for real change in their eyes. "Good morning," Keanu began, his voice calm yet commanding. "My name is Keanu Reeves, and I'm here to talk about justice. Not just the kind of justice you will be sworn to uphold, but the kind that transcends badges and courtroom. Justice is about treating every person you encounter with dignity and respect." As he shared his experiences, insights, and the lessons he had learned, Keanu saw the recruits lean in, ask questions, and engage in respectful dialogue. They seemed genuinely interested in becoming better officers, in building a better relationship with the community they were meant to serve. After the session, as Keanu gathered his notes, a young recruit approached him. She was barely out of her teens, her determination evident in her posture. "Mr. Reeves," she said hesitantly, "I just wanted to thank you. I joined the force to help people, but after everything that happened, I started to doubt my decision. Listening to you today reminded me why I chose this path." Keanu smiled warmly. "What's your name?" "Sarah Johnson," she replied. "Well, Sarah, I'm glad you're here," Keanu said. "The department needs people like you, people who are willing to learn, to challenge the status quo, and to make a difference. Don't lose that spirit." As Sarah walked away, Keanu felt a surge of hope. It was individuals like her who would ultimately determine whether the change they were fighting for would endure. Later that evening, back at the Community Justice Initiative office, Keanu sat at his desk reviewing case files and reports. The work never seemed to end, but every small victory, every life improved, made it worthwhile. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Maria Hernandez, the teacher whose educational vision had inspired so many, stood there, her face alight with excitement. "Keanu, I just came from the school board meeting," she said, unable to hide her enthusiasm. "They approved our curriculum for every high school in the district." Keanu stood and beamed. "That's amazing news, Maria. Your hard work is really making a difference." Maria's expression softened. "It's all of our hard work. None of this would have been possible without you." Keanu shook his head. "I may have been the catalyst, but this is about all of us. Everyone here working together, making change happen." They discussed the next steps for rolling out the curriculum, their excitement tempered by the knowledge that there was still a long road ahead. But as they finalized their plans, Keanu felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was what real progress looked like, not just speeches and protests, but concrete actions that would shape the city's future. As he finally headed home that night, Keanu paused outside the office, looking up at the clear, star-filled sky. A lot had changed in 6 months, and there was so much more to do. But for the first time in a long while, he felt peace. They were on the right track. Change was slow, and setbacks were inevitable. But with the community working together, they could build a brighter future, one step at a time. With renewed determination, Keanu started walking home. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but he was ready to face them, fueled by the hope and resilience of a community united for justice.